In this step, we're going to be working on getting a dialog to launch when we click on this plus button here. And before we get into that, we need to talk about how to launch dialogs in Lore. So if you open up your index.html file and you scroll down to the root, you're going to notice two elements that are here by default. And one has the ID of root, and this is where the application itself gets mounted. And there's another element here called dialog. And this element is here intentionally to mount dialogs. And there's two reasons that we'll touch on briefly in terms of why dialogs are split out this way. But essentially, it's because if you embed your dialogs inside of your application, they can be affected by CSS styling. So if they're inside components, they can be influenced by that cascade since they're nested children. And the other one is that if you mount your dialogs inside the main application, they can be affected by any click event cancellation you have. So they'd be susceptible to event bubbling, and sometimes your dialogs won't behave like you expect, depending on what children they're mounted inside of. So that's briefly why dialogs is broken out from the root, so that they can behave independently and as expected. So let's take a look at how to actually inject code into this dialog element. And to do that, we're going to go back to our create button component. And we're going to delete this console log statement. And so instead of logging something to the console, we actually want to render something to the application. And there is a helper in Lore that you can access under lore.dialog.show. And if you invoke this method, it takes a function. And that function wants you to return something that you want to be rendered to that dialog element. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to create an H1. And we'll just have it render a simple statement to the screen. So now I'm going to go back to the application. I'm going to refresh the page, and I'm going to click on this button. And when I do, you can see that there's dialog written to the screen. And so I'm going to inspect that. And you can see that it was rendered inside this dialog ID. So there's the main application above it and the dialog, and so they're completely isolated from each other. So for this application, we don't just want to render some simple text. We actually want to render a dialog. And since we're using Bootstrap, we can actually leverage some of its functionality to get a nice dialog to appear on the page. So to do that, navigate to getbootstrap.com. And if you click on their JavaScript link, you can find a modal in the navigation on the right. I'm going to click on that, and we're going to scroll down. And so there's a button here under Live Demo, and if we click it, we can see what a Bootstrap dialog looks like. So there's a bunch of text. There's a header we can put some text in. There's a button we can close, and if we open it, there's also a close button and a save changes. And there's this nice transition that comes in and out. So we want to leverage this in our application. Since we're using Bootstrap, we can get some nice dialogs here, and we don't have to write all the code to get this nice transition. So instead of our H1 tag over here in our component, we're just going to replace this with this example code from Bootstrap. So I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to replace the H1 with that. And some of this code isn't code we want in our JSX, and then all these classes, I need to rename them to class name. So I'm going to do a quick find replace. And I'm going to replace all of classes with class name. And with that done, I'm going to move this span tag down too. All right, with that done, I'm going to save the file and go back to the application and reload the page. And when I click on the button, you can see that we have one other error in the console, and it's complaining about tab index. Did you mean tab index camel case? So we're going to go back to our code, and I'm going to replace the lowercase with the camel case version and refresh the page one more time. And now when we click the button, we don't get an error. So we actually had the component rendered to the application. And if we open up dialog, we can see that once again we have the component here. But it doesn't have that nice transition that we saw in Bootstrap. Right? When we click this button, it launches the dialog. And the reason for that is we actually have to invoke it. The way that we're passing code in here, we don't get to use the Bootstrap shortcut. But what we can do, I'm going to clear the console, is if we look for that element, so we know it's under dialog and it has a class of modal, we can actually target that with jQuery. And so I can say, I want to find the element with the class of modal. We can see that there it is. And then there is a method that Bootstrap adds as a shortcut. And if we say modal.show and hit enter, it actually opens the modal on the page. And so we can close that if we want, and we can open it. And there's also a shortcut to hide it programmatically. And so we have this demonstration now where we've added some Bootstrap code for dialog, and now we can mount it to the page. All right, so let's take this a little bit farther. Let's go back to our component. And normally when you invoke this method, you're not going to have just straight up code here. So when you have dialogs, you'll often have multiple places in the application where you might want to use them. So let's start by creating a component and moving all this code into it. So I'm going to say lore generate component, and I'm going to call it create dialog. So now we've got this component here, and I'm going to copy all of this out, and I'm going to move it into create dialog. And then I'm going to save that, and then in create button, I'm going to pull that in. So I'm going to say create dialog equals require, and create dialog. And then here, I'll just say create dialog. I'm going to save that. Let's refresh the page again. And we're going to click our link and make sure that we're still being mounted. All right, so refresh. So there's nothing in the dialog. We click the button and we have our code injected into the dialog again. So the other thing we don't want to do now is we don't want to have to say modal.show to get it to display on the page, right? So instead of doing that from the console, we just want that to happen when we click the button. We want the dialog to be mounted, and then we want it to automatically have it open and transition into the user's view. So let's flip back to our create dialog and set that up to demonstrate it. So here we want, when this component is mounted, we want to invoke that method. So I'm going to say component did mount function. And when the component mounts, I want to show the dialog. So I'm going to say this.show. I'm going to create a function called show. And I'm going to paste a couple lines in here. And so when this shows, just like we did before with Bootstrap, we're going to get the node. So we're going to use React DOM.findDOM node to get this top element of our component. And then we're going to pass that into jQuery and invoke the modal method to show it. So the last thing we need to do to set this up is we need to import React DOM. So I'm going to require React DOM. And I'm going to save that. And we're going to refresh our page. And we're going to click the button. And look at that. Now our component gets injected into the page and is automatically displayed. So that's pretty cool. So I'm going to close that. All right, so to set up the rest of the section, we've created one dialog and we've mounted it to the page. And we have this boilerplate code for Bootstrap that's going to show up in all the dialogs. So at this stage of our application, we really just need a way to create and edit and delete data. And if we want to keep building out these dialogs, we could take this and we could copy it, and we could create an edit dialog, and we could create a delete dialog, and we could adjust them, and we could add fields to them. We could sort of build them out. And that's a lot of boilerplate just to get some dialogue so that we can get a basic create, delete, update experience in our application. But Lore has a hook that you can plug in that will auto-generate these dialogues for Bootstrap. And so in the next step, we're going to learn about that hook and get our functionality implemented.